So you're coming and you're speaking. You're the keynote speaker here, and I know a lot of people are concerned about what's happening in Europe. What do you want people who are going to hear you speak to understand about Russia and the war in Ukraine that maybe gets lost in day-to-day headlines?
Well, first of all, I'm of course very grateful for the opportunity to be part of such a worthy and noble cause. This speaker series is organized by the Women's Board of Wolfson's Children's Hospital, and it engages for many, many years in fundraising for children's healthcare in Northeast Florida. And it's really, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be a part of this. But I'm also very grateful for an opportunity to speak to American audiences, to Western audiences, and in this case, to speak to Northern Florida audiences about what Russia is today. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to show American audiences a different side of Russia. Because too often, people in the West, people in the United States, people in Florida only see that side of Russia that Vladimir Putin's propaganda want people to see. It's sort of this facade that, supposedly all Russians support Putin's dictatorship. All Russians support this criminal war of aggression that Putin's regime has been leading against Ukraine. That Russian society is this monolith that is supposedly behind the so-called national leader. This image created by Putin's propaganda is absolutely false. And the fact is that, there are so many people in Russia who have a very different vision for the future of our country, who have a very different idea of what Russia should be, who want Russia to be a normal, modern, peaceful, democratic nation. And testimony to this are the horrendous numbers of repression, the horrendous scale of repression that Putin's regime has been engaging in for many, many years, but especially so since the launch of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. It is a shocking and sobering fact that today's Russia alone holds more political prisoners than the whole of the Soviet Union, which is 15 present-day countries put together, did 4 decades ago in the mid-1980s. And of course, the fastest growing category on the list of Russian political prisoners are those of my fellow Russian citizens who are publicly protesting against Putin's war.
Well, and so let me interject. When Americans hear political repression, it really can kind of sound abstract to us. So, what does repression look like in ordinary life in Putin's Russia, your perspective?
Well, let's start with the fact that the two most significant, most prominent leading opposition figures in Russia, Boris Nemtsov and Alexei Navalny, have been murdered, literally, on Vladimir Putin's personal orders. Boris Nemtsov was shot dead on a bridge, literally in front of the Kremlin, 11 years ago in February of 2015. Alexei Navalny was poisoned in his prison cell in the Arctic penal colony 2 years ago in February 2024. It's important to remember then when we're speaking about Vladimir Putin, we are not only speaking about a dictator, we're not only speaking about an illegitimate usurper, he is all of those things, but we're also speaking about a murderer in the most direct and literal sense of this word. But political repression also means, of course, politically motivated imprisonment. And as I mentioned, today's Russia holds more political prisoners than the whole of the Soviet Union did in the mid-1980s, according to publicly available and self-admittedly incomplete figures that we have from human rights groups. There are about 4,500 people in Russia who are imprisoned on politically motivated grounds. More than 1,700 known political prisoners who are known by name, who can be identified, whose cases have been vetted by human rights groups. And it is the reality of today's Russia that you can get a longer prison sentence simply for speaking out against the government, simply for speaking your mind, than real criminals can get for burglary or for rape or for murder, even in some cases. My prison sentence was 25 years.
This was your experience, right? In 2022, you were arrested, and as I understand it, sentenced to 25 years. How is it that you're free now? And it sounds like this is an example of what you're talking about.
So I was indeed sentenced to 25 years in prison. This was the longest sentence for any political prisoner in Russia since the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953. Since then, they have been even longer. But when my sentence came in 2023, he was the longest since the death of Stalin. And my so-called crimes were my 5 public speeches where I spoke out against Putin's dictatorship, against his criminal war of aggression against Ukraine, against the political repression, political murders in Russia, against Putin staying in power in violation of the presidential term limits, and so on. I recall on the day that I was handed my 25-year sentence by Moscow City Court. This was on April 17, 2023. I was escorted down into the basement area of the court where there are cells for holding prisoners. I was walking down the steps with my hands behind my back and handcuffs and a police escort around. And the commanding officer of the police escort turned to me and he said, "So let me get it right. Did you just get a 25-year prison sentence for 5 public speeches?" And I said, "Yes, I suppose I did." And he thought for a second again, and then he said, "Well, at least I hope these speeches were good." I said, "That's probably not really good."
Well,
But seriously
they
speaking,
were good enough. They caught the attention of
well,
the establishment who said, we're going to go after, in this case, Vladimir
in
Kara-Murza.
the Orwellian and distorted reality that is the reality of Vladimir Putin's Russia, I suppose, yes, this is actually the recognition on the part of the regime, on the part of Putin's dictatorship, of all those people who are standing up against it. I was absolutely certain just 18 months ago that I was going to die in that Siberian prison. The only reason I'm sitting here speaking to you now is because in August of 2024, 8 different countries, but led by the United States and Germany, negotiated an international prisoner exchange, which was the largest East-West prisoner exchange since the end of the Cold War, whereby 16 people were freed from Putin's prisons in Russia, half of them foreigners, including US and German citizens, half of them Russian political prisoners, including me. And in exchange, Putin got back some of his agents and spies who were imprisoned in the West. But I'm a lucky one. I'm sitting here and speaking to you. I've survived this. But as we are speaking with you now, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, as I said, more than 4,500 people are imprisoned in Russia on politically motivated ground. People who have committed no crime, who've broken no law, who are only, quote unquote, guilty of having the conscience to distinguish right from wrong and of having the courage to say it out loud. And I think it is very, very important that the free world, the Western world, stands in support and in solidarity of all those people in Russia who are unjustly imprisoned because they believe in democracy and peace. And this is one of the things that I'm going to be talking about when I'm in Jacksonville.
Vladimir, the Kremlin claims that the war has broad public support. So if that's true, then why does the government need to be so heavy-handed and have these aggressive crackdowns to try and maintain control?
You know what? That's the central question. I always, say that actions speak louder than words. And yes, if you listen to Putin's propaganda, they'll tell you that everybody in Russia supports, the regime. Everybody in Russia supports the war. But their actions tell a very different story. 2 years ago, at the beginning of 2024, we had a so-called presidential election in Russia. We had Putin and a couple of clowns that he handpicked alongside him on the ballot to imitate competition. And then there was, this one guy, one candidate, a lawyer, a former member of parliament named Boris Nadezhdin, who announced that he was running for president of Russia as the anti-war candidate, that he was going to stop the war in Ukraine. And the public response was just incredible because suddenly all across Russia, you saw hours-long lines of people. This was in the middle of the Russian winter, who stood outside this guy's campaign headquarters to sign his ballot petitions to get him registered as a candidate. Now, of course, he was not registered as a candidate. Opposition candidates in Putin's Russia are never allowed to contest elections, real opposition candidates. But suddenly, the very sight of these thousands and thousands of Russians standing all across the country to sign the ballot petitions for this anti-war candidate, within a matter of days, this fake propaganda facade constructed by Putin that everybody in Russia supposedly backs this war, that propaganda facade collapsed. And the horrendous repression that we have already discussed with you, the fact that we have so many political prisoners. Memorial, Russia's most respected human rights group, recently announced a shocking figure that every single day, on average, 5 people in Russia are subjected to various forms of politically motivated repression. 5 people a day. If everybody really, as the Kremlin claims, supported the war and supported Putin, why? Why would this regime feel the need to keep our society in a state of constant fear? Fear is the last tool that Putin has to stay in power. He has no legitimacy. He has no real democratic mandate to speak of. Of course, for many years, we haven't had a single free and fair and competitive election in Russia. The only way he continues to stay in power is through war, propaganda, and repression.
So in what you write for the Washington Post and what I've heard you speak about, you've said guilt is individual, not collective. So how should Americans hold the Russian state accountable while avoiding the trap of like blaming the entire Russian people at the same time?
But that is a very important question. And since the time that I've been out of prison, I see many problems with the way that the free world sort of acts towards the Putin regime. And, on the one hand, we see glaring holes in those sanctions that really should be in place and really should be enforced by the Western world to weaken and undermine Putin's war machine. For example, there was a recent report published by a leading London think tank, the Royal United Services Institute, which showed, this is totally shocking, showed that up to 30% of all the Russian military equipment and Russian military technologies used by Putin against the war in Ukraine still come from Western or Western allied sources. This is unacceptable. How is this possible? It speaks to the fact that there are so many glaring loopholes in the sanctions mechanism that should be enforced. Another area, of course, is Putin's shadow fleet. Those illegal ships, tankers that he uses to illegally sell his oil in contravention of the price caps imposed by the international community. And of course, he uses that money to finance his illegal and criminal war. Again, there should be more action on that front by Western democracies to make sure that that loophole is closed. But yes, on the other side, you're absolutely right. There is no such thing as collective guilt. Hannah Arendt, a great historian who wrote about Nazi Germany, who studied many years and researched Nazi Germany, she wrote that, if everybody is guilty, then no one really is. So collective guilt is actually a good way for the people who actually are guilty to escape responsibility, right? Because you can just blame everybody. No, there are very specific people who are responsible, first of all, for committing the crime of aggression against Ukraine, Putin and his leadership. And then, of course, there are tens of thousands of, Russian military officers and soldiers who are committing war crimes in Ukraine. And my position is, and many of my colleagues and friends in the Russian opposition, is that every single one of them has to be brought to account and has to be held responsible for all the crimes they have committed. But of course, it is unacceptable to just discriminate against people solely on their basis on their nationality, solely because they happen to be Russian citizens or have Russian as a language. It's no more acceptable to discriminate against somebody on the basis of their nationality than it is to discriminate somebody on the basis of the color of their skin.
Well, even to go back to that example about World War II, blaming all Germans as bad people because of what the Nazis did, that's not okay, right?
Or
And you
Japanese,
talk,
what happened to Japanese Americans during the Second
there
World
you go,
War? Is now near
another
Washington, D.C.
example.
There's a memorial, to the wrong that was done to them. So yes, absolutely. Collective guilt, collective discrimination is never acceptable.
So I'd like to help have you explain this. So we talked about sanctions a moment ago. Magnitsky sanctions, something that I think a lot of people are not really aware of. How is that different than the broad sanctioning that we hear when the government says we're putting sanctions on them and that's going to change things? How are Magnitsky sanctions different?
The Magnitsky Act was a law that was passed first by the United States of America, enacted in 2012, and later on passed by dozens of other democracies across the world, including Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, the European Union, and many, many others. And I've had the honor of working to help pass this law, to advocate for the passage of this law, alongside such leaders as the late Senator John McCain and former Senator Ben Cardin, who were the leaders in the United States Senate on passing this legislation, bipartisan leaders. And the premise of this law was very simple, that instead of targeting entire countries with sanctions, to essentially to punish everybody collectively for the actions of the leadership or the dictatorship of that country, the Magnitsky Act put forward a very simple premise, that accountability for human rights abuses should be personal, that those people who are personally complicit in human rights abuses or in corruption, that they should be personally held responsible. And the way the Magnitsky Act does that is by saying that those people who, based, of course, on verified and trusted information, are personally complicit in human rights violations, in abuses of the rule of law, in corruption in their own countries. It doesn't just go for Russia, this is global now. That those people will no longer be allowed to get visas, own assets, or use the financial and banking system of the country in question, in this case, the United States, because for so many years, officials and oligarchs of the Putin regime, we're getting used to stealing in Russia from our people in Russia, and then coming to the West, including to places like Florida, and spending and stashing away that stolen money in countries that do have democracy and the rule of law. And such hypocrisy was totally unacceptable. And so the premise of the Magnitsky Act was to put a stop to that, to put a very clear standard that those people who are responsible for undermining and destroying the basic norms of democracy in their own country will no longer be able to come to the United States or other Western countries and enjoy the benefits and the privileges that democracy offers in the West. A very simple statement from Western democracies led by the United States that the crooks and the human rights abusers will no longer be welcome.
So, Vladimir, as we wrap up, a very simple question to you. After going prison, everything that you've endured or experienced, why keep speaking out on this topic when it's so dangerous for you?
Oh, look, Russia's my country. It's my home. I love my country. It's an amazing, beautiful country with so many talented people. And for so many years now, it has been living under a crooked, corrupt, murderous, criminal, aggressive KGB-led dictatorship under Vladimir Putin. And I think my country deserves so much better. And the world deserves so much better too. Because Russia, needless to say, is a major part of the international system. It's the largest country in the world. It's the largest country in Europe. It's a permanent member of the UN Security Council, a nuclear-powered state. And whenever Russia is dictatorial and authoritarian at home, it will always be aggressive abroad. Very simple statement, very clearly proven by history, because a government that does not respect the rights and freedoms of its own people will not respect the borders of its neighbors. And Vladimir Putin is showing this very clearly with his war against Ukraine. And so I want to see Russia become a normal, peaceful, modern, democratic country. And that will, of course, be very good for my own country and my own fellow citizens. But this will also be good for the rest of the world, for the rest of the international community, and for the rest of Europe, because the only true way to secure peace, stability, and security on the European continent and in the international community at large is through a democratic and peaceful Russia. I have absolutely no doubt that that day will come, and everything that I and my colleagues in the Russian opposition are doing has as its goal to try to bring that day a little closer.
Okay, the dog started barking just in time for me to mute it, so nobody gets to hear that. But
Right.
that was where I was wrapping up. So I thought if I mute now, I can hear your full response, which
Okay.
is how that worked out. Thank you, and thank you for very clearly explaining personally what's at stake for you.
Thank you
I
so much
think
for
that's
the opportunity.
inspiring, and I think that's as I just get to visit with you in this 15 minutes or whatever, I can sense that that's really at the heart of what you're doing and why. So that's very compelling, and I appreciate sharing like
Thank you
that.
so much, and it's an honor to be in your program. Thank you so much.
Yeah. With your team, I'll send kind of a link on where you'll find this, and then, like I say, the night that you're here in Jacksonville to speak, I hope I get to meet you in person.
Very much looking forward to it, and I'll make sure to put it on my social media once the interview comes out. Thank you
Okay,
so
great. Thank you so much. Great to meet you.